Remember when almonds were super cool and like everyone thought almonds were the best nut ever? Oh my gosh, so much better than peanuts. But now we have this sort of natural evolution in the world of nuts. And we realize that, wait a minute, maybe almonds aren't that cool. Macadamias are where it's at. And now when I look at the research, I probably say, yep, macadamia nuts are probably the best nut for weight loss, but maybe I'm biased because I like the taste of them. So in this video, I have a few reasons why macadamia nuts are so unbelievably potent for weight loss. But first, we have to look at the association between macadamia nuts and weight loss first, okay? Understanding that correlation. Okay, so there was a study that was published in the Clinical and Experimental Pharmacology and Physiology Journal. Took a look at 71 subjects, okay? And these 71 subjects were divided into 3 groups. One group ate coconut bread, another group ate macadamia nut bread, and another group ate butter bread. Okay, well, what they did is they had them eat 2 loaves of bread per day for 3 weeks. I don't know, I don't care what it is, what kind of bread it is, but eating 2 loaves a day for 3 weeks is probably not a good thing, but I'm taking it these are pretty small loaves. Anyway, about the same amount of calories in each group, ranging from like 420 to 480-ish calories, right? So about the same amount of calories. The key differences being that the macadamia nut bread was rich in monounsaturated fats compared to saturated fats in the other 2, and it was relatively low in saturated fat compared to the other 2. So with this, they found interesting things. The only group that lost weight, was the one group that consumed macadamia nut bread, predominantly made up of omega-7s and omega-9s, these monounsaturated fats. Well, correlation does not always equal causation, but when we start backing out the data more, we get a little bit more of an understanding. There was a study that was published in the journal Mediators of Inflammation. Now, this was a rodent model, but this study took a look at a control diet, then a control diet that was higher fat, compared to a control diet with macadamia nut oil, and finally a high-fat diet with macadamia nut oil. Well, both the high-fat diet with macadamia nut oil and control diet with macadamia nut oil ended up showing ultimately a reduction in inflammation in these rodents. So what's happening there? Well, it could be the fact the omega-7s, the omega-9s have a potent effect on inflammatory cytokines to begin with. But they also saw this correlation. They saw a decrease in inflammation, but they also saw reduced hypertrophy in the adipocytes, which means less enlarging of the fat cells. Overall, the mice that had the macadamia nut oil, whether it was high fat or controlled diet with macadamia nut oil, ended up having smaller fat cells. Now, I know it's a rodent model, so we can't 100% take it to the bank, but it starts to help us understand why macadamias are working the way that they're working. So that brings me to the very first category. Inflammation. What is potentially happening here? Why does inflammation affect weight loss? I want you to think of inflammation as just like a static, like that's causing all this noise. So leptin doesn't work well, insulin doesn't work as well. It affects all kinds of other signaling from the hypothalamus. It's associated with the brain and weight loss. So we have to look at that, but let's look at some data. There's a study that was published in Molecular Nutrition and Food Research. Okay, it took a look at the effect of palmitoleic acid, that's omega-7, which is a really cool fat that is specifically like very high in macadamia nuts. Now they found in an in vitro model, so this is like a petri dish study, so in vitro, this palmitoleic acid seemed to reduce inflammation, but it also seemed to affect specific chemocatic responses. So it had an effect on cyclooxygenase enzyme 2, COX2, which is literally what you would take an aspirin for. Like aspirin is a COX2 inhibitor, therefore an anti-inflammatory. So it seemed to attenuate COX2 and also MCP1, these things that affect inflammation. Now it's in vitro, so we don't take it all the way to the bank, but again, there's other research that continues to back up omega-7s and omega-9s with inflammatory responses. But that's just one particular angle. Another piece that I think is very important is the insulin resistance piece. If you are insulin resistant, eventually it'll catch up with you in the way of weight, okay? If you're so insulin resistant that you have high circulating levels of insulin, okay, because the insulin isn't like your body's just producing more and more and more to try to get the glucose into the cell, eventually the insulin will inhibit what is called hormone-sensitive lipase. It will inhibit these enzymes that break down fat. So high insulin levels all the time will make it hard for your body to burn fat. Well, there was a study that was published in Endocrinology. This was another in vitro study, but it's fascinating and it paints a picture. It took a look at pancreatic beta cells and how they are affected by different fats combined with sugar. So pancreatic beta cells combined with saturated fat and sugar triggered cell apoptosis. It triggered the cells to die. On the contrary, in vitro pancreatic beta cells with high amounts of sugar, glucose, alongside omega-9s in this case, didn't lead to any issue. There wasn't cell death. It didn't go through apoptosis or the self-destruction. So pancreatic beta cells are what produce insulin. So if we have saturated fat and sugar, it affects the pancreas. If we have omega-9s, like in macadamia nuts, and sugar, it doesn't seem to, at least in vitro. Now I want to get into some more things too, but I want to stop for just a second because when it comes to macadamia nuts, we really do have to factor in a lot of things. We have to factor in sustainability, we have to factor in how they're grown. So I wanted to make a mention that today's video sponsor, although not correlated with any of this research, okay, full disclaimer there, is a company called House of Macadamia. Really cool company that is growing their macadamia nuts in Africa, which is now the largest producer of macadamia nuts. Cool thing about this House of Macadamia company is they grow their macadamia nuts just a short 1-hour drive from where they manufacture. So when you're talking about freshness and being able to really preserve quality and quality control over the entire thing, they are the bee's knees. That is perfect. And that's really the things that I look at. Now, when it comes down to these macadamia nuts that are farmed, they are 100% farmer owned. Okay, so good quality, good control, and overall just good for the communities that are involved as well. But they have some cool things. They don't only have just regular macadamia nuts, but they have keto-friendly and vegan chocolate-covered macadamia nuts. They also have macadamia nut bars, and they're the only company that I know of that has macadamia nuts as the first ingredient in their macadamia type snacks, like their macadamia nut bars. So all these things are keto-friendly, low carb, and of course they have the omega-7s, the omega-9s, which I'm talking about all the time. There is a link down below to save 20% off, so use code THOMAS20 to save 20% off whatever you want from them, whether it's macadamia nut bars, straight up macadamia nuts, the onion flavor is unreal, or just all of the above. So again, that link is down below. They are doing good things and big things, and I want to shout a big thank you to them for sponsoring this video and allowing me to get the word out when it comes down to macadamia nuts. So continuing on this insulin resistance piece, there was a study published in Biochemical Journal, took a look at rats, and they found that rats that were treated with omega-7s, okay, the palmitoleic acid, it ended up increasing their glucose uptake by 2x. So somehow the palmitoleic acid is affecting in rats how the sugar, the blood sugar, was taken up into the cell. Now, on the contrary, rats treated with saturated fat ended up having a decrease in the glucose taken up by the cell. It just goes to show the difference that different lipids, different fats can play on glucose utilization and insulin resistance. Now, we do have to tie into something that's very important. When we look at weight loss in general, we have to look at appetite as probably one of the biggest factors. There's all these different mechanistic things that we can go on and on about. Oh, this is doing that to this cell, and this is doing that with this insulin model, and yada, yada. But at the end of the day, the most basic fundamental thing is our desire to eat. And if our appetite is suppressed, we're not going to eat as much. Simple calories in, calories out there. No matter how much you want to debate that, that is still thermodynamics, a law of physics, and it applies. If you don't eat as much, it's harder to gain weight, right? So there was a study that was published in the journal Appetite that I found fascinating. Now this again was done in rats, but it was very interesting because with this, when rats were given omega-7s, even compared to omega-9s and compared to saturated fats, they ate significantly less. It modulated their appetite tremendously. Okay, now there's some potential mechanisms here, like why this is happening, but let's dive in a little more first. For one, they noticed that omega-7s, palmitoleic acid, increased what's called cholecystokinin, CCK, which I've talked about a lot on this channel. That is something that is secreted in your GI tract after you eat, specifically when you eat, well, monounsaturated fats. And it is a heavy, heavy appetite suppressant. It basically tells your brain, hey, we're busy digesting fats. We need pancreatic lipase, we need all this stuff. So brain, chill on the appetite for a second so we can deal with this fat over here. So increasing CCK is great. Also increased peptide YY, which works along a similar vein, very much so keeping us satiated. Now, one of the ways that this ties in with the inflammation piece we talked about before is leptin. Remember, leptin is a signal that comes from your fat tissue to your brain. It's supposed to tell your brain, hey brain, we have enough fat on hand here, so no need to increase appetite. This person's totally fine on fuel. You can take a back seat for a second. We got this. But when we have a lot of inflammation, it ends up impeding that leptin signal. So you end up producing more and more and more leptin in an effort to try to reach the brain, but the brain's never getting the signal. It's never picking up the phone. It's become resistant. And the more circulating leptin that you have without it impacting your brain, the more you just continue to get hungrier and hungrier and hungrier, even though you're pumping out more leptin until you're potentially burning out. So if we can modulate that inflammatory response, then maybe that leptin signal can be restored and the proper hunger cues and hunger signals can ultimately work. We also have to remember the fiber piece. Okay, when you're looking at a serving of macadamia nuts, you're looking at how many carbs are in them. Usually you're talking a couple grams of net carbs, but the total carbs are somewhere in 5, 6, 7, depending on the serving size. And that's because the bulk of them are fiber. Now, so much evidence coming out in the way of fiber when it comes down to not just the gut microbiome, but satiety in general, okay? So yes, they delay gastric emptying with the fiber itself, but they also may feed the microbiome, and that impacts our glucose tolerance, that impacts how we utilize carbohydrates in the first place. So when we look at overall why they are also good for weight loss, is the carb count is so low to begin with. Not saying that going low carb is the only way to lose weight, but you are controlling insulin levels a little bit more with a food that's going to keep you satiated and possibly prevent you from going and indulging in those high glycemic carbs in the first place. So kind of lead your meals off with maybe eating some protein, then some macadamia nuts, then your carbohydrates if that's going to be the case. You even want to have them there in the first place. Now, how many macadamia nuts would I really suggest you have? Okay, you do need to make sure that you're getting a wide diversity of different fats in your diet. I personally believe that 20% of your fat calories should come from saturated fats. So you get proper nerve health and all the, the fats for the brain that are good. But no more than really 20% of your daily calories from fat should come from saturated fat. That's it. You don't really need more than that. Okay, then I would usually say try to get a good 20% if possible from omega-3s. I know that's difficult, but the rest you have some more flexibility. After you check the box for saturated fat, after you check the box for the omega-3s, polyunsaturated fats, then the rest is left to you, really. You can go with the monounsaturated fats that you get from like olive oil, oleic acid, right? That's omega-9, oleic acid. You can get the omega-7s from the macadamia nut oil. Now, the interesting thing is that omega-7s can help potentially increase the availability of the omega-3s as well. So when you look at this, it might exacerbate or positively influence the omega-3s that your cells take up by increasing the omega-7s. So with that, I usually recommend having 1 to 2 ounces of macadamia nuts per day. You don't need to really go super above and beyond that. So when the argument is macadamia nuts are super expensive, well, you shouldn't be eating handfuls and handfuls and handfuls of this stuff. You should be eating moderate 1 to 2 ounce servings of it per day, because any more than that is too much calories coming from nuts to begin with. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.